Well, today I want to talk about something that has touched all of our lives in different ways over the last 2.5 years or so. I want to talk about COVID, and we're not going to have a gripe session about it. All of us probably have things that we could gripe about and would maybe even love to gripe about. But I actually would like to put it in the review mirror today. I'm trusting that the pandemic is over and that we won't have any more waves of it. And so it's time to move on. Time for us as individuals to move on. And as we move on from any stage of our lives, it's important to acknowledge both the positives as well as the negatives that have happened in the stage before, so that we can grieve the losses. And that's something that we as Canadians don't necessarily do really well. But the truth is, all of us have lost things during this pandemic. When you think about a pandemic, the first thing you think about is losing loved ones to illness. And probably many of us have. I lost a good friend during the pandemic to COVID. But there's many, many other kinds of losses. We could go on for a while here listing them. I had surgery that I talked about last week. That was delayed because of COVID. We all lost freedoms during the pandemic. That's a big loss. There was weddings that I couldn't go to because of the pandemic restrictions. Funerals were restricted, so we couldn't go to funerals. There was family reunions that were delayed or missed altogether. There was graduations. I had to cancel a trip that I had booked that was during the pandemic. People lost their jobs. Friendships were lost during the pandemic. I'll be honest with you, I lost a lot of sleep during the pandemic, just trying to figure out what to do and not to do and so on. Maybe you lost trust in certain people. Maybe you lost trust in me. Maybe you lost trust in government. Maybe you lost trust in other things. That's a loss. Maybe you lost trust in medical science, whatever. Maybe you lost business during that time, or maybe there were other opportunities you lost. Whatever it was, there were different losses that we all experienced. And this morning, I actually decided to just jot down a list of my losses. And within 5 minutes, I had listed over 12 things that I lost during the pandemic. That's just me. So some people have lost lots more than that. Maybe for you it was less. Wherever you were at, I'm pretty sure that all of us lost something. And so today, I just want to take a moment to acknowledge that, all of us acknowledge that we did have losses. And then I want to take a moment to kind of grieve those losses and then leave them with Jesus so that we can move on. If we don't grieve, and I'm going to explain this a little more in detail, we often end up carrying that baggage with us. And that's not something that's healthy for us. So I want to start by looking at Jesus' handbook for life, the Bible. And I want to look in Matthew, which is the very first book of the New Testament, which is the second 1/3 of the Bible. And And Jesus here in Matthew chapter 5, 6, and 7 is preaching a sermon. And it's often referred to as the Sermon on the Mount. And scholars believe that this was sort of Jesus' go-to sermon, that he probably preached this sermon a number of times during his time here on earth in different communities. And so this was sort of his message, if you will. So we want to look at Matthew chapter 5, verse 4. And there it says, "Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted." And that's the comfort that we're after. Now, our overall ability to truly thrive in life actually is very directly linked to how we handle the losses in life. I've often wondered why in self-help books and motivational circles, we don't focus more on how to deal with losses. We tend to focus on dealing with our strengths well, building on our strengths, and having a positive attitude, and all of these things. And even in schools, we teach this, but we don't talk a lot about dealing with our losses well. And the truth is that psychologists are discovering now that how you deal with your losses actually determines how well you do in life a lot more than how you build on your strengths. Isn't it interesting that Jesus said that those that mourn are blessed? He knew that. 2,000 years ahead of the psychologists, he understood that. And all of us face losses in our life. If you've never had any kind of loss in your life, well, I'd like to meet you, because every one of us face losses of different kinds. And if we don't deal with them well, we actually won't be able to move on and thrive in the next stage of our lives. So let me first of all differentiate between mourning and grieving, because they are a little bit different. So grieving is the emotions that we feel on the inside as a result of loss. So if you lose a loved one, the tremendous sadness that you feel inside, that's grieving. Mourning is actually when you express that grief. So mourning is something that we as Canadians aren't really that great at. We feel the sadness, but we don't express it very well, generally speaking. Now, the interesting thing is that as Canadians, we have different excuses for why we don't mourn well. You know, we're embarrassed, or we're scared that we're going to completely fall apart if we give a voice to our emotions. Some people even think it's unspiritual to mourn. Well, obviously, Jesus didn't think that. And sometimes I wonder, quite honestly, if it isn't a little bit of the British influence on us. You know, that stereotypical British stiff upper lip thing, you know, that we hold it together no matter what. And so we have this reserve thing. But the Jews, they were actually good at mourning. They were very good at expressing their grief. And Jesus acknowledges that that is important. And it's interesting that Jesus said, "Blessed are those who mourn." He did not say, "Blessed are those who grieve." So it's not just feeling the feelings that's important. It is actually giving expression to those that's important for us in order to find the comfort that Jesus gives us. I believe that there are actually a lot of people that walk around with uncomforted pain, grief in their lives. They are walking around with this burden on their heart, and because they don't give expression to that grief through mourning, it comes out in other ways. It might come out in anger. We've had a huge increase in rage of different kinds, road rage and all kinds of different rages now. And I believe some of that may very well be grief that has not been expressed in mourning. I think it can come out in depression, it can come out in cynicism, it can come out in sarcasm or distrust, unhappiness, workaholism is another expression, obsessions, addictions even, can all be ways in which people are dealing with their grief rather than mourning. And so basically, these are all passive-aggressive ways of handling the grief inside. And a lot of people don't even see it in themselves. They don't have the self-awareness to realize this actually comes back to that loss that I've never really dealt with. And it's sad. Well, Dallas, how do you know if you've actually dealt with a loss properly or not? How do you know if you're actually over it? Well, I would like to quote a pastor named Andy Stanley here, and he says, pay attention to the tension. Pay attention to the tension. And what he means by that is when something comes up in conversation or even a thought in your mind, if you feel a tension inside, if you feel a twitch of emotion, that is a signal that you're not finished mourning what happened there. And so it's so important to complete the process in our lives in order to be able to move on in a healthy way. And let's face it, all of us, the first step in the process of moving forward in our lives is to be honest about where we're at. You cannot move forward without honesty as a starting point. You have to be real about where you're at. If you build on the future on an assumption or on a false foundation of just pretending, you won't have a thriving future. So how do we deal with grieving, mourning, the past? Well, I want to look at another passage a few pages over in Matthew chapter 11. And there in verse 28 through 30, we read, and this is Jesus speaking, he says, "Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light." So what is Jesus saying here? He's saying, trying to carry your burdens of loss on your own really will not work. Now, let me put this in a bigger context. When Jesus came to earth, he had a mission. His main mission was to introduce the new relationship with God called the New Covenant. So there had been an old covenant with God, between God and the Jews for thousands of years, actually. And now Jesus came to replace the old covenant with a new covenant. And there were some very significant differences between the old covenant and the new covenant. The old covenant basically was a covenant where you were relying on your own ability to make sacrifices and to take care of your own spiritual condition. So there was a whole system for sort of carrying your own burdens, if you will. You brought them to God, but there was this sense in which you were ultimately responsible for sacrificing and following through on all of the legal requirements in order to take care of your burdens. But Jesus came and he changed all of that. The new covenant, the essence of it is that we all are called to be humble enough to accept help with our burdens. In the old covenant, you could be that strong person that just did all the right things and you were sort of fine. But in the new covenant, none of us are strong enough. We are all called to acknowledge that I can't do this myself. I need help. And Jesus is the one that helps us. And so the new covenant actually requires a lot more humility than the old covenant did. Bringing our burdens to Jesus can actually be quite an emotional experience. We have to actually, as Canadians, get over our fear of our emotions in order to be able to bring our burdens to Jesus. And I believe a lot of people get stuck there because they're so afraid of, what if I fall apart? What if, I just can't keep myself together? And Jesus says, well, you need the humility to be able to let it go anyway. And so the first step is actually coming out of denial about our losses. First step is getting past that stage where we go, well, I'm fine. No, I'm fine. And being honest enough to acknowledge, well, actually, that did hurt. That did bother me. And when we actually come out of our denial, then that opens the door for other aspects of grieving. Like there's emptiness and loss and sadness and sometimes even anger. And we eventually, if we allow that process to happen in our lives, get to a place of acceptance where we accept the fact that, yes, this was a loss, I can't change it, but I can move on. And we can leave it behind. And acceptance is where we find rest for our souls. And so many people never get to that place of acceptance because they never allow themselves to go through the process of grieving emotionally. And to be honest with you, I suspect that we actually have a lot of people all around us who still are feeling the losses, but are not willing to admit it. And they have unresolved stuff as a result of COVID, and they don't even realize it. And it's coming out in a bunch of different ways. If you look at the statistics just here in Alberta, you'll notice that drug abuse has gone through the roof in the last 2.5 years. I believe a very significant contributing factor to that may be unresolved grief from all the losses. Domestic violence has shot through the roof right here in Whitecourt. I was talking to the lady at the RCMP who is in charge of that area, and it's just mind-blowing the amount of domestic violence we are seeing right here in Whitecourt. Mental illness has gone up dramatically. Divorce rates are way up. and on and on and on. And I believe a lot of this has to do with the fact that we are very not good as Canadians at this whole mourning thing. But here's the good news. You and I have Jesus. And Jesus helps us with our mourning. He helps us to move forward to thrive in life. And we actually have something that could profoundly help our neighbors all across Whitecourt. We could help each other come to Jesus with our mourning. Let's turn a few more pages in Matthew to Matthew chapter 18 and verse 3 and 4. There we read, "And he said, 'Truly I tell you,'" and that's Jesus, "'unless you change and become like little children, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. Therefore, whoever takes the lowly position of this child is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven.'" Now, there's many different aspects to this that we could talk about, but I just want to focus on one thing, and that's mourning. Children naturally are really good at expressing their grief. What's the very first thing most babies do when they come out of the womb? Cry. They just lost something huge. The warmth and the safety and security of being inside their mother. And now they're facing a big, scary world all on their own. And what's the first thing they do? Ah! And actually, that's how we know that a child is healthy, that they cry. If a child doesn't cry, we are very concerned. And children go on being very open with their emotions of loss until we as adults teach them to not do mourning so well anymore. We teach them that, no, big boys don't cry, and that's enough crying now, and all of that thing. And we teach them to stop mourning their losses. And then we go through the rest of our lives less healthy than what we were when we were born, emotionally. And I believe one of the things that Jesus is saying here is that in order to thrive in his kingdom, one of the things we need to do is learn how to express our grief well, to honor our pain, to be honest about our pain. And God meets us most powerfully when we actually are honest about what hurts. I don't know what your experience with Jesus has been, but my experience has been that when I am totally honest with Jesus about what hurts inside, he meets me in a very profound way. One of the deepest losses for me during COVID has to do with my relationship with my mother. My mom and dad live over in Sweden. And of course, I haven't been able to travel over there to see them. And my mom is suffering from deteriorating memory. And so I haven't seen them in over, almost 3.5 years. And my mom is getting to the point now where I'm not even sure if she will recognize me when I see her next time. The other morning, she asked my dad at the breakfast table what his name was. That's a big loss for me. All of us have probably had big losses in different ways. And we need to Be honest about that. So my question for you this morning is, what did you lose due to COVID? I'm going to ask the greeters if they would hand out a little sheet of paper to everybody right now. And if you don't have a pen or something to write with, let them know, and they've got some extra pens as well. And I'd like you to just take this sheet of paper and write down your losses. And in a minute, when we're closing the service, Pastor Johan is going to lead us in another song. And during that song, I've got a little bowl here at the base of the cross. I'd like to invite all of us to take a minute and just go to the cross and surrender your losses to Jesus. Symbolically, Jesus is represented by the cross. And just put your little sheet in that bowl. And if you want to stay and pray for a little bit, you're welcome to do that. Or if you just want to walk up and put it in there and then go back to your seat and pray, that's fine too. But I'd like us to do something physically symbolizing that I am laying my burdens down. I'm giving them to Jesus. The losses that I have felt from COVID are in His hands now. I'm not going to live in denial any longer. So I want you to think through as many potential losses as you can. And maybe you've already worked through some, but just jot them down anyway. But especially if there's something that you think about and it creates a little bit of a twitch in your heart, those are the things that you need to lay down. And one of the things I'd also encourage you to do is later on, ask the people that are closest to you what they notice about you. Are there topics that come up that make you emotional, that get your juices going? If that's the case, there's probably unresolved grief there. And those are things that Jesus wants to help you resolve. Has everybody gotten a paper? Okay. There's a few people here. One person here at the front as well. 2 people here at the front, Dale. Right up here. Okay. James as well. Right here at the front.
Opened up a whole can of worms here.
Yeah, no kidding. And if you're watching us online, I encourage you to do the same thing. Grab a piece of paper and a pen. Just start jotting down your losses during COVID. Okay, anybody else that's not gotten one so far? Okay, good. Wilson, maybe I can have one too. Thank you. Okay. Let's pray. Dear Jesus, today we are coming to you to mourn so that we can receive your comfort. All of us have experienced losses of different kinds during the last 2.5 years. And we are openly acknowledging that that hurt, that it affected us in different ways that just made us see how fragile things can be. And today we want to acknowledge that we feel that loss. And we ask you to bring us comfort. As we surrender these things to you, we ask you to fill our hearts with your peace, with your sense of comfort and strength. And I pray, Jesus, that we would be able to move on in healthy ways. I pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.